Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on February 8th, 2026, a single election in Japan could fundamentally alter the balance of power across all of Asia for the next generation? And what if I told you that this transformation is being driven by a 65-year-old woman who just 3 months after becoming Japan's first female prime minister has made the most audacious political gamble in modern Japanese history by calling a snap election that could either establish her as Asia's most influential leader or destroy her career entirely? Sane Takaichi's decision to call early elections represents far more than domestic political maneuvering. At a moment when China and the United States are locked in an increasingly dangerous competition for Asian dominance, Japan's election outcome will determine whether Asia develops a third pole of power, capable of challenging both superpowers, or whether Japan remains a junior partner dependent on American protection, while China expands its regional influence unchecked. The timing of this election reveals Takaichi's sophisticated understanding of geopolitical opportunity. She assumed power in October 2025 during a period of maximum regional instability, with China's military provocations around Taiwan escalating, North Korea conducting unprecedented missile tests, and the United States distracted by domestic political crises and Middle Eastern interventions. Rather than waiting for stability, Takaichi has chosen to exploit this chaos, positioning Japan as the decisive factor in Asian security calculations. The electoral mathematics that enable this gamble demonstrate the fragility of Japanese democratic institutions and the potential for rapid political transformation. Takaichi inherited a minority government controlling just 233 seats in the 465-member Diet, requiring constant coalition management and compromise to advance any significant legislation. The collapse of the 26-year partnership with Komeito in October 2025 left her governing through an untested alliance with the Japan Innovation Party, creating a razor-thin majority that could collapse at any moment. But Takaichi's personal approval ratings tell a different story than her party's institutional weakness. Polling consistently shows her support above 60%, with particularly strong backing among younger voters who view her as a transformational figure, capable of breaking Japan's decades-long economic stagnation and diplomatic passivity. This gap between personal popularity and institutional control has created the conditions for her high-stakes electoral gamble. The policy agenda driving this election represents a fundamental departure from Japan's post-war consensus on both economic and security policy. Takaichi's proposed $32 billion stimulus package, centered on eliminating consumption taxes on food, directly challenges the fiscal conservatism that has dominated Japanese politics since the 1990s. Her willingness to expand government debt to fund economic growth reverses decades of austerity policies and positions Japan as a counterexample to the neoliberal economic orthodoxy that has constrained Asian development. The international implications of these domestic policy changes extend far beyond Japan's borders. Takaichi's stimulus agenda, if successfully implemented, could demonstrate that major developed economies can pursue aggressive fiscal expansion without triggering currency collapse or inflation spirals. This would provide a template for other Asian countries seeking to break free from International Monetary Fund-imposed austerity measures and pursue independent development strategies. But the security dimensions of Takaichi's agenda represent an even more dramatic break with Japan's post-war trajectory. Her statements, suggesting that Japanese military forces could intervene to prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, represent the most explicit challenge to China's regional ambitions by any Japanese leader since World War II. This position goes far beyond the defensive posture that has characterized Japanese security policy for 7 decades, positioning Japan as an active guarantor of regional stability independent of American leadership. The Chinese response to Takaichi's Taiwan statements has been swift and economically devastating. Chinese tourist arrivals to Japan dropped 30% in the final quarter of 2025, with particularly severe impacts on major tourist destinations like Osaka and Kyoto. Chinese corporations have begun reducing their Japanese investments in supply chain relationships, signaling Beijing as recognition that Japan under Takaichi represents a strategic threat that must be contained through economic pressure. This economic warfare between China and Japan creates opportunities for other Asian countries to benefit from the competition between the region's 2 largest economies. South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines are all positioned to capture Chinese investment in tourism that would otherwise flow to Japan, while potentially attracting Japanese companies seeking to diversify their supply chains away from Chinese markets. The American calculations regarding Takaichi's rise reveal deep uncertainties about Japan's future role in the U.S.-China competition. While Washington officially welcomes Japanese willingness to take greater responsibility for regional security, Takaichi's emphasis on Japanese strategic autonomy suggests a potential partner that cannot be easily controlled or directed by American policy preferences. Her success could accelerate Japanese defense modernization and regional influence in ways that eventually challenge American hegemony in the Pacific. The financial market's response to Takaichi's electoral gamble has been notably volatile, reflecting uncertainty about the sustainability of her fiscal expansion plans. The yen has declined to 18-month lows against the dollar, while Japanese government bond yields have reached levels not seen since the early 2000s. These market pressures create immediate constraints on Takaichi's policy ambitions, while also demonstrating the global significance of Japan as domestic political choices. The demographic and social forces supporting Takaichi's rise provide crucial context for understanding the sustainability of her political coalition. Japan's younger voters, facing decades of economic stagnation and limited opportunity, view her aggressive growth policies as potentially transformative for their economic prospects. Her gender represents symbolic break with the male-dominated political establishment that has presided over Japan's relative decline, while her working-class background resonates with voters who feel disconnected from Japan's traditional elite. However, the coalition politics required for Takaichi to maintain power reveal significant vulnerabilities in her political position. The Japan Innovation Party, her primary governing partner, represents urban, reform-oriented voters who support economic modernization, but may be uncomfortable with her nationalist security positions. The loss of Komeito eliminated a crucial link to Japan's Buddhist voters and peace movement, creating gaps in her coalition that opposition parties are working to exploit. The opposition strategy for the February 8th election demonstrates the high stakes involved in this political contest. The newly formed Centrist Reform Alliance, combining the Constitutional Democratic Party with defectors from Komeito, represents a direct challenge to Takaichi's nationalist agenda. This alliance advocates for diplomatic engagement with China, reduced defense spending, and more cautious fiscal policies that prioritize debt reduction over economic expansion. The international precedents for Takaichi, whereas its political strategy, provide both encouraging and cautionary examples for understanding the potential outcomes of her gamble. Margaret Thatcher's early electoral success in Britain and Golda Meir's leadership during regional crises offer models for how female leaders can use external threats to consolidate domestic political support. However, the examples of leaders like Liz Truss in Britain demonstrate how quickly ambitious policy agendas can collapse when they conflict with market expectations or institutional constraints. The regional security implications of Japan's election extend throughout East Asia and the Pacific. A Takaichi victory would likely accelerate military cooperation between Japan and countries like Australia, India, and the Philippines that share concerns about Chinese expansion. This could lead to the formation of new regional security arrangements that operate independently of traditional U.S.-led alliance structures, fundamentally altering the architecture of Pacific security. The economic nationalism embedded in Takaichi's agenda also has implications for global trade relationships and supply chain structures. Her emphasis on Japanese technological sovereignty and reduced dependence on Chinese manufacturing could accelerate the formation of alternative production networks centered on democratic allies. This friend-shoring approach could reshape global commerce in ways that extend far beyond the immediate Japan-China relationship. The technological competition between China and Japan adds another layer of complexity to this electoral contest. Takaichi's support for increased government investment in semiconductor manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and green energy technologies positions Japan to compete directly with Chinese technological development. Success in these sectors could establish Japan as a technological leader independent of both American and Chinese innovations. The cultural and soft power dimensions of Takaichi's rise also deserve attention for understanding the broader implications of Japan's political transformation. Her success as a female leader in a traditionally patriarchal society sends signals throughout Asia about changing gender roles and political possibilities. Her emphasis on Japanese cultural values and historical pride represents a challenge to both Chinese cultural influence and American cultural hegemony in the region. As Japanese voters prepare to cast ballots on February 8th, they are making decisions that extend far beyond domestic policy preferences or partisan loyalties. They are determining whether Japan will emerge as an independent great power capable of shaping Asian affairs, or whether it will remain a secondary player dependent on external protection and economic relationships controlled by larger powers. The stakes of this election have been recognized by international observers who understand that Japan's choice could trigger a fundamental realignment of Asian geopolitics. A decisive Takaichi victory would signal that middle powers can successfully challenge the bipolar competition between the United States and China by offering alternative models of development, security, and regional cooperation. But the risks of Takaichi's gamble are equally significant. Electoral failure would likely end her political career and could discredit the broader movement toward Japanese strategic autonomy. Market rejection of her fiscal policies could trigger economic crisis that undermines Japan's ability to play an independent regional role. Military confrontation with China over Taiwan could expose the limits of Japanese power and invite devastating retaliation. The international community watches this election with recognition that its outcome will determine not just Japan's domestic trajectory, but the broader question of whether the 21st century will be defined by bipolar competition between superpowers or by a more complex multipolar system, in which middle powers maintain strategic autonomy and regional influence. Sanae Takaichi's electoral gamble represents more than personal political ambition or domestic policy preference. It represents a test of whether democratic middle powers can successfully assert independent roles in an increasingly polarized international system. The woman who 3 months ago was considered a transitional figure may emerge from February 8th as the architect of a new Asian order that challenges the assumptions of both Beijing and Washington about regional power structures. The quiet determination of Japanese voters filing into polling stations across the archipelago will echo throughout Asia and beyond, as their choices determine whether the world moves toward greater multipolarity or continued superpower dominance. In the voting booths of Japan, the future of Asian geopolitics hangs in the balance. This election represents more than a domestic political contest. It is a referendum on whether middle powers can chart independent courses in an age of superpower competition, and whether Asia's future will be shaped by 3 great powers rather than 2. The implications will reverberate far beyond Japan's borders, influencing the strategic calculations of every nation from Seoul to Jakarta as they navigate the emerging multipolar order.